Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another edition of the Spurs Chat podcast. In this edition, I'm absolutely delighted to bring on journalist and broadcaster Danny Kelly, the legend Danny Kelly. Danny, welcome to the channel. How are you?
Oh, Chris, I'm great. Thank you very much for having me. There's lots of Spurs podcasts and all kinds of casts out there, including the one I do myself. But you are so nicely, and I like what you do as well. So I'm delighted to do it, actually. And I hope we can fit it all into about 15 minutes.
I'm sure. I don't think so, especially the way both of us can talk.
Sure.
Danny, you've done so much in your career. Talk us through some of the highlights of your career, because, of course, you worked in radio, TV, written media. You've even been in a couple of films.
Yes, I've been very lucky. You know, the truth is, Chris, I never set out to do any of these things. My father was a railman, having emigrated from Ireland, which is where I'm talking to you from now. I've gone back there, and I followed him onto the railways. And I was really interested in football and pop music and all the rest of it. And it's a long, long story involving me being a shop steward and filling out the pages of a sort of Xerox to Union magazine with reviews of records I'd heard, things like that. And somebody seeing it at a TUC conference and ringing me and saying, do you know what the NME is? And I saying, yes, I'm working at Victoria Station. And they're saying, well, we like what you write. Would you want to do some stuff for us? And, that all accelerates. And eventually I'm the editor of the NME and then editor of Q. So I've been a very lucky man. I've edited the two greatest pop music and rock music magazines that the world has ever known, with all due respect to Rolling Stone. And, that was all going along really, really well. And at some stage, my interest in sport, I kept banging on about various things, and I don't know how it came about. I can't even remember now, but I started talking about sport, perhaps when I was reviewing the newspapers on the old Radio 5, and gradually that started to expand as well, and I made the leap from one. I still love music and spend all my money on music, but I then made the leap into talking about sport in general. I've done TV, radio, made magazines, launched an internet company, which we were lucky. It was the second British internet company to actually float on the stock exchange, 365. I'm okay, Chris, at making things face the public. And that's what I've been doing. The films you mentioned, I'm in the Football Factory, the film about football hooliganism, because a friend of the directors was pointing out that the bits where they were doing the announcement of the draw for the FA Cups, I think Spurs and Millwall was the issue, wasn't it? Sounded really, really bad. So they dragged me in to do that. I gave up my £60 appearance fee as demanded by Equity. I said, as long as I get a credit, I've never been in the film. Then I'm in another film. And I have to tell you, I'm in another film completely naked. It's a film called Divorcing Jack. It's a really brilliant film, which got lost in the shuffle because it came out the same week as Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. My then girlfriend was working on the film, and there's a scene in which the corrupt local councillor is having what can only be described as a love session with his lover. And she said this has been written because David Thewlis, the great David Thewlis, has to run through the room where they're doing this act. And she said they're doing it on space hoppers. And she said, I've scoured the earth, Dan, and none of the actors will do it for me. She said, would you do it? And I said, Chris, well, look, when I'm an old man, I thought it was going to be in Essex then. When I'm an old man in Ireland, balancing something red and pleasant on my chest to drink, will I think my life been better or worse for appearing in this film? So I said, I'll do it. I go over to Northern Ireland. It's been filmed in Bangor. Very cold winter's day. That's important. I'm given this little pair of underpants, and I'm sat on my space hopper, and he's doing the other actor, bouncing up and down. David Thewlis keeps running into the room and jumping through the window, and somehow he's not being shocked enough. So the next time he goes out for take 20, whatever it is, it's actually take 3 or 4. So I know what I'll do. And to the horror of the other actor, I took the pants off. So I'm now completely naked, sat on Space Hopper. This time when David Hewlett throws the door open, there is a proper look of shock on his face. And later in the year, the next day, he told me that he'd gone back to the hotel after the day's filming, got himself nice and relaxed, and rang people to tell them what had happened to him today and what he'd seen. And he even described the scene on the space opera itself. And I have to say, given that I was very nervous and given that it was a very cold day, I want to thank him for exaggerating the way he did. So yes, I've been in films, and you can look up; it's out there, and you'll see a brief glimpse of me with no clothes on. Proud post.
Dan, you also host now the podcast A View from the Lane. Tell us about how you got involved with that.
Look, I love podcasting. I think it's the future, and I say that as a radio man down to my DNA. The idea that people can get the content when they want it rather than having to sit and wait for it. They both have their beautiful, you wouldn't want to listen to a live commentary, while you're out walking the dog 2 days later. But the podcast, it struck me years ago, was the way forward. The Athletic has the View from the Lane podcast. There are many good Spurs podcasts out there. And I think it was pretty good. A friend of mine who was involved in its production rang me and said, "This is really good. Could you listen to it, see what else we could do with it?" And I listened to it. I said, "Look, it doesn't face the public. It just needs somebody who can present it." And he said, "Will you do it like that?" And I said, "Sure." It also means they've got an older Spurs fan on it now as well to add a kind of background to all of the other stuff. And the blokes I do it with, they're not all Spurs fans, but they are the people who cover the club, and they know what's going on to a large extent. We occasionally get it wrong. And they've also joined in the jollity I try to bring to the thing when I start to investigate obscure corners of history, culture, and all the rest of it. They join in very, very well. I say, I'm not going to diss any other podcast out there. I don't hear them all for a start, but if you want a Spurs podcast that's informed and it's not afraid to be intelligent, then The View from the Lane is one that does that very thing. I also talk a lot, Chris.
I love it. That's exactly why you're here. That's exactly why you're here. Yeah. Danny, why Tottenham? Why Tottenham for you?
Really difficult, Chris. I was born in Praed Street Hospital in Paddington because my father was a Roman and worked at Paddington. But I was brought up in Islington. My parents lived in Islington. We lived within, not sight of Highbury, but within sound of the stadium. On Saturday, you could hear the cheering. Very close, as I would say. Now that the big stadium's there, at my primary school, Our Lady of the Sacred Heart, you can literally see the stadium from the playground. And in those days, when you could just bowl up to football grounds, my uncles, who seemed to arrive in sort of drafts every now and then, would top up the number of uncles who were arriving from Ireland to work on digging the Victoria line, to be truthful. And they would all take me to the football in London. Occasionally, the first time I remember being in a massive crowd was at Fulham. Bill Shankly's Liverpool were the coming thing. I was 8 or 9 years of age. They took me down there. The crowd at Craven Cottage appeared to be, 1 million people to my infant eyes. But of course, my previous biggest crowd I'd ever been in was probably at a church, at Mass. And then, because we lived in Islington, 1 week I'd get taken to Arsenal, 1 week I'd get taken to Spurs. I should have been an Arsenal fan. Something about Spurs, I always say it's the white shirts. I love their white shirts. I love them to this day. The less design on them, the happier I am. I know we've got a sponsorship of these days and maps of the borough and all the rest of it. But I think it was those white shirts. And something, I became a rock and roll journalist. Something inside me, even as an 8-year-old, told me that Spurs were rock and roll and Arsenal were the British Foreign Office. I didn't know that the Hillwood family who ran the Foreign Office were in charge of them, but something instinctively told me I had to support Spurs. And I'd like to tell you, Chris, and all the 2.5 million people watching this now, I'd like to say I've never had a moment's regret, but there have been times under Arsene Wenger when I literally could have nailed my foot to the coffee table. Such was the level of my bitter regret.
Danny, what do you remember about your first games as a young boy supporting Spurs?
Yeah, I remember People who remember White Hart Lane before it got redeveloped, a little tear rolls down his fat face as he remembers the old ground. The new ground is fantastic, amazing, but there's a lot of my blood, sweat, emotion, tears, and money in the old stadium. The edge of the pitch was ringed with a sort of brick wall that came up to there with white hoops on the top of it. That was the decorative finish of it. So I can remember when you were a young person in those days, you'd be sent down to the front to watch the game, and the hoops were always pressed up against me. My only other real memory, two things. One is that the halftime scores were done in the most extraordinary way. I'm sure you've heard this before. At the edge of the pitch, there was big placards, A, B, C, D, E, F, and you had in the programme, A might be Aston Villa against Nottingham Forest, and about 20 minutes into the second half, somebody would laboriously wander out to the edge of the pitch with some little bit like the old substitute boards and put the scores up. So you'd have an idea halfway through the second half what the score had been at half time. It's ludicrous. I guess the other thing I remember is I saw the last few seasons of Jimmy Greaves' time at Spurs. And, you're at an age in your, like 10, 11, 12, 13, you're at an age where you want heroes, don't you? And Jimmy Greaves scored every week. I remember he had a pair of lucky boots and I was down close to the pitch. And you could see that at one stage they were held together with kind of tape, because this was the days when footballers now wear a new pair of boots for every game. They probably changed them at half time, if truth be known. So my earliest memories are of Jimmy Greaves, really. Not Spurs weren't very good in the late 60s. They won the cup in 67, but to me, this whole thing about winning trophies, it was irrelevant. I used to go for the excitement of being at a football ground, and it's the same excitement I get now, 50 odd years later, more than 50 years later, as you're walking towards, particularly at night, any stadium with the lights on, people chattering about what the game's going to be like, and there's still something about football and a football ground that I absolutely love. And Spurs is the best place for me to do that. But my early memories are really of the ground itself and of Jimmy Greaves.
Danny, you talk about Jimmy Greaves there. Of course, Harry Kane is about to break his record at Spurs.
Wow. Even the words.
Can you compare those two? Who is the better player?
It's hard to compare, and I'm sorry, I will give you an answer. Of course I will. It's hard to compare because the football is so different. Jimmy Greaves played on mud heaps against people who were allowed to literally kick him up in the air. Harry Kane has the luxury of playing on billiard tables with people who are barely allowed to touch him. And let's be fair, if they do touch Harry, he goes down, doesn't he? So, there's that. But the truth of the matter is, when Jimmy Greaves left to go to West Ham, I was 13, I think, and my father was very concerned. I was so devoted to Spurs and to Jimmy Greaves that I went to bed really early because they were very concerned, like all immigrant parents, that I got my sleep to go to school and learn stuff. But I remember my father would never do this. He came upstairs and woke me up in the middle of the night because he'd seen on the 10 o'clock news, as it was in those days, Jimmy Greaves had gone to West Ham. He wanted to break the news to his son ever so gently so that I wouldn't learn it at school from somebody else. The answer to your question, of course, look, there is no comparison. They are both great players. I have no hesitation in saying that. Greaves is the greatest English goal scorer. And I say that because he'd already scored 130 goals for Chelsea before he went to Spurs, And I know Harry got a couple for Norwich and Millwall and stuff, but it's not quite the same thing. But the size and greatness of Kane's achievement is this: I have carried Greaves' goal scoring record around with me as a piece of knowledge that is immutable, that cannot be changed. We all know that everything we know is wrong and everything changes all the time. But there are two things we definitely know. Everest is the highest mountain in the world, and Jimmy Greaves' goal scoring record will never be broken. Those two things I know, and one of them turned out to be wrong. Think about it. Someone to break Greaves' record would have to score 27 goals a year, every year, for 10 years. And Kane's doing that in less than 10 years. He is extraordinary. He is amazing. I don't suppose they're such different players. Harry does all kinds of things in midfield these days. And Greaves didn't. He was a finisher. So I wouldn't say who's the greater player. I'll tell you what, they are the two greatest English strikers of all time, and they both played for Spurs. I, sir, having seen them both, am a very, very lucky fella.
You are indeed. What do you think will happen to Harry Kane? He's out of contract at Spurs in 2024. Do you think he will leave in the summer? There's lots of speculation, as per usual.
This is such a hard one to answer. I mean, you could argue that if he has to go, then having broken that record and the England goal-scoring record will go as well, then you could argue there is a natural time in all these things. But I suspect Daniel Levy will want a lot of money for him, and quite rightly so. And despite what Chelsea have done in the transfer market in the last few weeks to further inflate what's already a ludicrous situation, I remain hopeful that he can be persuaded to stay at one club. And if he doesn't, though, and if he decides that he wants to go on, having broken Greaves' record, I didn't like the idea of him going when he was so close to it to Manchester City a year ago. And in fact, it was making me sick on my cornflakes. I could live with it. I don't want him to, though. I want him to stay and do whatever he's going to do along in, I mean, let's be honest. He said he wants to play till he's 40. I mean, it might be that I might be finished to, pop off the mortal coil by the time he's finished playing for Spurs with a bit of luck. Well, I mean, I'll ask you, Chris, what do you think is going to happen? Because I don't know.
Do you know what? Sadly, I can see him doing what Teddy Sheringham did. Leave Spurs, go and win a trophy somewhere at another Premier League club and perhaps come back, because he would have broken the Spurs record. He'd have broken the England record. Of course, he wants Alan Shearer's record in the Premier League. Sure. But I'm like you, Danny. Of course, I want him to stay. But you mentioned the word trophies first. It is my favourite subject on this channel, trophies, because we have been without them for so many years. Why do you think that is? Why haven't Spurs won trophies in so long?
Oh, well, I know the reason. Because, and first of all, let me say, I do understand that I'm a bit selfish here, because I say, trophies aren't the important thing. It's playing football, scoring goals, and all the rest of it. Bear in mind, of course, I'm old enough to have seen Spurs win lots of trophies. I once worked out, including replays, I've been to 30 cup finals, It has dried up in recent years. Let's not kid ourselves about that. Is it 3 in 30 years? I mean, it really is, by comparison with when I started watching the game, a real drought. The answer to the question is, of course, that it is not easy to win trophies in England. The way that the game has changed, and the last transfer window just gone has proven it, you are already in a World Super League if you're playing in the Premier League. 11 of the 20 richest clubs in the world play in one league, the Premier League. That's by the latest Deloitte's figures. Pretty soon, I suspect it will be 12, 13 or 14. So to win a trophy, you have to overcome a spectacular array of people who are fantastically well equipped with money, fans, stadia, and all the rest of it. As Spurs are, let's not kid ourselves. But think about it. Now, this is going to change with the League Cup final. Take the bigger clubs in England. Spurs haven't won a trophy since 2008. Everton haven't won a trophy for 30 years. Newcastle haven't won a trophy for 50 years. Manchester United haven't won a trophy for almost a decade, or 6-7 years. You add them all together, you're getting up towards 200 years. And these are the big clubs in England. It shows you the dominance that Abramovich's money, the oil money at Manchester City, and Liverpool's astonishing manager, the effect they've had on the game. Now, look, in that time, Wigan have won a trophy, and we saw what happened to them. Portsmouth have won a trophy. Help me, who else has won a trophy? Leicester have won the title. So all things are possible. But I think talking about trophies and not admitting that you are in the toughest environment world football has ever seen to get yourself across the line, I think that's disingenuous. Could Spurs do more to win trophies? Yes, they could. They could do better work in the transfer market. We've seen £100 million being spent to replace Kyle Walker unsuccessfully. Hopefully Pedro Porro will do that. We've seen them give Seville two footballers and 20 million quid in return for what? Half a good game against Crystal Palace and a lovely haircut and a meme about haircuts in the case of Brian Hill. I mean, that's the truth of it. I'm not an eke out person because I'm not unrealistic. I don't know how that would happen. How can I How can we force those people, the private owners, to sell the club? I don't get into trouble with this all the time on the podcast. I do, Chris. The fact of the matter is, we, the fans, own the club in one way. We own it in that without our collective memories, thoughts, passion, to use an overused cliche of a word, there really isn't any club. But that's not how the owners see it. It's a business to them. And the only way we could ever really affect their thinking is to do the one thing that no football fan can countenance doing, and that is to stop supporting the club. So we are in a difficult logjam at Spurs if you want real big change. I was pulled up, I was moaning bitterly about the team for the first half of the season. Gary Neville's speech on Monday Night Football about, how bad is it really at Spurs had a real effect on me, because I think when you're in the echo chamber of other Spurs fans, it's very easy to get into a spiral of thinking that everything's terrible. 3 or 4 good results, and you know about the games I'm talking about in the next few weeks, and they could be in the quarterfinal of the FA Cup, the last 8 in the Champions League, and still, challenging at least for the European places in the Premier League. So I'll tell you why I want them to win a trophy. I want it for the young supporters, the kids who go to school with their Spurs lunch bags, if people still have lunch bags, and loving Spurs and Harry Kane and all the rest of it. And if I remember the thrills I got when I was a younger man, watching them win things either in the stadium or on television, I'd like that to be replicated for younger people, because I think it would go a long way to cementing their lifelong love of both Spurs and the game itself.
Danny, what does the FA Cup mean to you? Because, of course, the last time we won it back in 1991 for a record 8th time then, when Gary Mabbott lifted it at the old Wembley Stadium. Do you think it's about time that we took a competition like this a little bit more seriously? And if I can add another question on that, if I was to give you the choice, Spurs finishing in the top 4 and not winning the FA Cup, or winning the FA Cup and finishing 5th? Well,
I know what Daniel Levy would choose. But look, the FA Cup is incredibly important to people my age, because it was regarded as big a competition as winning the league. There's no qualms about that. That was true. The FA Cup was the biggest day, the final of the English football season. And the fact that Spurs had won it more than anybody else was a matter of tremendous pride to me, everyone who supports the club, and the club itself. Over the years, we've seen that record eroded and then surpassed by, among others, Arsenal. And, it's not ludicrous they haven't won it for 30 years, because, as I say, it's hard to win trophies in England. It's ludicrous that for probably 15 years that they haven't set out to win it, that they've allowed themselves to put out weakened teams and all the rest of it. And I know all the arguments about sports science and all the rest of it. I'm not a fool. I know all those arguments. But equally, there are ways of nursing squads of players. Spurs have got north of 20 international footballers on the books. And I think sometimes it is, you're suggesting and hinting, I think, it's a lack of will. I don't think the Newcastle United fans, if they win the League Cup in a couple of weeks' time, will be saying, oh, it's only the League Cup. It will be a monkey off their back. It will be a relief. It will be a validation of them going to the games and spending the kind of money they do. And Spurs fans could feel all that as well if they could get themselves over the line in the FA Cup. I mean, the issue, Chris, and these things are only statistics, and they're from a very small sample. Not only did we won the FA Cup more than we'd gone more than anyone else, we'd gone decades without losing a semi-final. The problem is now we keep losing semi-finals, don't we? Is it in all competitions? Is it 7, except for the Champions League, in domestic semi-finals? It's FA Cup. I think we've lost 7 or 8 on the spin. I mean, that's not natural, is it? That's where people are allowed to use that vile word Spursy, which ought to be a positive about a team that plays great football, that comes from behind and wins games, that scores great goals, a club that has won the Puskers for the best goal in the world for the last 2 years and is in line to win a third with Richarlison's volley in the World Cup. None of them by Harry Kane, by the way. And yet, because of things like always losing semi-finals, which what it must, if you're under 40, that's all you know is Spurs lose semi-finals. It's terrible.
Why do you think that is, though, Danny? Because many people talk about a mentality problem. Do you think there really is one there at Tottenham?
I don't buy that, and I'll tell you for why. Because, and I know managers always about winning mentality, buying winning mentality, and all the rest of it. Because it's been 20 different Spurs managers, hundreds of footballers. By the law of averages, by now, the kaleidoscope of all of that would eventually have come to a place where, they would be winning something. I think it's as much bad luck. I don't think there's a mentality problem. I understand that Manchester United under Sir Alex Ferguson were afraid to go back to the dressing room. The world's changed from there as well. People say that Antonio Conte, and by the way, best of luck with his health issues. Absolutely, he's a human being. He's been through a lot this season, and I've given him plenty of stick. But on a human level, you can only wish him all the best. He's a serial winner. Is he? Well, when's he managed Oldham? Excuse me, I've got some water somewhere. I mean, there are some of these teams, I could manage them, that the elite group of managers try to make sure they're in very, very winning positions before they get there, And Chelsea have won trophies because of the huge investment, all the rest of it, with caretaker managers, and managers have gone on to do absolutely nothing else. Roberto Di Matteo won the Champions League with Chelsea. So is he a serial winner? Has he got the winning mentality? Or has he just got the right players at the right time? If you start saying that Spurs have got some kind of mental block about it or lack the phrase of winning mentality, I think you might as well give up. Because I think these young men want to win things. They want to play well. And it's a question of getting all those things aligned, as it was under Pochettino, when a talented group of players became a very difficult team to beat, and a very difficult team to beat late on, and until that all went south, no one was talking about Spurs having a mentality problem then, were they?
Well, let's talk about Mauricio Pochettino, because of course he took Spurs to a Champions League final. We didn't spend money in various transfer windows, 518 days altogether. We didn't spend a penny. Took us to a Champions League final. Of course, it didn't work out. A couple of months later, he was fired. Was that the right decision for you?
I was heartbroken. I fell out with Jamie O'Hara on air on Talk Sport about it. I think I might have even been rude to him. I've apologised since, because he was going on about how great it was going to be with Mourinho. Spurs hadn't won an away game for a year. And you can't change all the players, so you have to change the manager. Also, there comes a time after a certain amount of years where any team leader in any walk of life has the same messages to give and impart in the same voice. And perhaps you need a change from that. Pochettino is a lovely fella. Clearly is a good football manager, and put together there, let's not kid ourselves, a great Spurs team. People will say they didn't win anything. Well, they didn't. Wigan won something. Are they a great team? No, they weren't. And he left the club. The mark of it, Chris, is that, he left the club with not one person saying, oh, thank God, good riddance. They might have said about time, but they didn't say good riddance. And now, of course, the problem is that he is like the king across the water, and the temptation is always to go back to him. And there are very few moments in English football where that going back works. On the continent, it works all the time. Managers go back to clubs and look at, all right, he's not responsible for the corruption at the club. But, Allegri's gone back to Juventus. It happens all the time. Carlo Ancelotti's doing all right at Real Madrid, isn't he? And if anything, God forbid, happened to Carlo, Zidane would be back in there and would do just fine, I love Maurizio, though. And if he was to come back, I fear it wouldn't work, but I would welcome him with open arms.
I think that's going to be our next manager. I really do.
Do you?
Danny, I'm the same as you. It felt like a death in the family. I know some people might think that's a bit extreme, but I felt that down about it. But of course, the switch to Jose Mourinho happened extremely quickly. If people had an early night and then woke up early in the morning, 1 minute you got Pochettino, next minute you got Jose Mourinho. When Jose Mourinho come in for me, I felt that this is the time. We're going to get over the line. We're going to win a trophy. What did you think of that Jose Mourinho appointment? And of course, he was then sacked 6 days before a cup final.
I thought, I mean, because I'm on record, because luckily everything I think can go back to the time. I thought it was a terrible appointment. I think he has rehabilitated himself at Roma, but he had become a poisonous person in professional football from the moment he tried to poke out Valverde's eye during the Classico. I looked at him through slitty eyes myself. Now, I've met and worked with Jose Mourinho when he first came to London. I spent a day at Chelsea's training ground when he was the BBC London Sports Personality of the Year, and he can be absolutely charming. He's knowledgeable about the world. When he talks about his family, the place of human beings in the world, it was charming. I think the game had curdled him. By the time he gets to Spurs, he'd had a bad experience at Real Madrid, a bad experience at Manchester United, a bad experience at Chelsea, where in getting involved in the removal of the club doctor, he pulled on a string that unraveled the team. She was very popular, but it's not always easy to see that. In the same way as that time when Tim Sherwood bawled out Sandro on the television after a Spurs defeat, I think maybe at Chelsea. And I thought, isn't Sandro the most popular person in the dressing room? The team just stopped playing for him, you know? I thought Mourinho, I don't buy into this Mourinho thing anymore. He's a decent manager. He might have won the League Cup. Let's be truthful. That's a possibility. But he was never going to play the kind of football that has traditionally satisfied Spurs fans. And this has been the issue since Pochettino left. Spurs have appointed 3 negative results-based negative managers who think that, you know, the way to win the game is to make sure you don't concede first. Whereas traditionally Spurs managers have been happier with, we'll go out and try and get the first goal. And if they get 2, we'll get 3. I didn't think it was going to work, Chris, and I was surprised when they got rid of him when they did, because there was a cup final coming up. But I'm not party to what was behind all that. And you know, people say, "Oh, they were about to pay him a bonus to win the League Cup." Of course, you know, Spurs have lots of money. They wouldn't be worried about a few bob like that. There's something else going on there. And I'm sorry it didn't work out, because I want Spurs to win things. Of course I do. But I never had any faith that it would be under Mourinho.
Did you not change your mind about Mourinho once you saw the Amazon documentary?
Not really. It was. I thought it shone a less harsh light on him than I had become used to thinking about him in. There was something weird. But the thing I thought about that was and of course, he's a very professional person. He was playing up for the cameras a little bit. The thing about that documentary was Daniel Levy having to be in his office the whole time, like a super fan who'd bought their favorite pop star and used to go in the morning and say, "Go on, sing me one more, sing me one more."
Yeah,
it was clear that let me put this way: the problems that Pochettino hinted at were stated boldly by Mourinho and have been amplified by the very miserable press conferences Antonio Conte occasionally lays on us. So it can't be that they're all bad managers. And you're right to hark back to when Spurs didn't freshen up the team, not because they didn't have a tremendous team, they did, not because it was hard to see where they could have made it better if you think about the players in the team at the time, but because it is just the natural order of things. And it's a textbook example that I'd be using on these UEFA coaching courses, saying you even if it breaks your heart, you have to let go of player X, because you have to stir up the pot every now and then. Otherwise, everybody gets just far too complacent. But about Mourinho, as I say, the Romans have taken to him hugely. Although after every defeat now, his behaviour becomes more and more strange. I believe last night when they were losing to the worst team in Serie A in the Italian Cup, he departed the bench 2 minutes before half-time. He's a one, as they say, isn't he?
Yeah, he also got a picture taken of the team when they lost and put that out on social media, which I thought was a little bit strange. We waited 72 days for a new manager, Nuno Espirito Santo, come in. Of course, it didn't work out for him. Antonio Conte come in. Danny, I'm hopeful that Antonio Conte is going to be successful at Spurs. But from what you've said so far, you don't seem that much of a fan of him.
Look, he is a very intense manager, and we've seen, with Guardiola and Klopp, these top sort of rotating elite tend to be very intense managers. Carlo Ancelotti wins the Champions League without being remotely intense, it seems, just becoming mates with the players. No, my problems with Conte are about his attitude to Spurs. I know how big, how important, and how beloved Spurs is across the world. And when people say they haven't won trophies and all the rest of it, I say, absolutely fine. You say what you like about them. I know what they're like. He gives off a vibe that he feels it's slightly below him to be at Spurs at the moment. He gives off a vibe that he's doing us a bit of a favour being there. And I've got no time for that at all, I'll be honest with you. And again, I wish him nothing but the best as a fella. And the fact that he's left Spurs in a situation now where they're paying £40 million for footballers while he has not committed himself remotely to the club in the future, I don't like this at all. I think Daniel Levy's got himself into that situation. But it isn't good for me as a Spurs fan to see a manager who at least isn't saying the right things. Look, let's use an example of someone who was it wasn't a great manager, but he was a great bloke. Martin Jol. He clearly loved the club and expressed it at every possible opportunity. He didn't have the finances to do much better than he did. And he also got sacked in that ludicrous way. I just don't like the fact the way that Conte does the press conferences. Be upbeat, praise the players when they deserve praise, and stop using the club for a power battle with Daniel Levy. Because let's be truthful. What does history tell us? If he gets into a power battle with Daniel Levy, only one person is going to win. Now, I know it would be a Pyrrhic victory, if that's the right word, for Daniel Levy, because if he lets Conte go or force him out of the club, he has nowhere else to go. He will be, as you're already hearing from the away fans, he will become the focus of all dissatisfaction, won't he? Whereas up to now, it's tended to be a left back, a right back, or the manager, centre back, whatever it is. Now it'll be Daniel Levy, won't it?
Danny, what do you make of the style of play under Conte, and when was the last time you were entertained as a Spurs fan?
You're putting me through the ringer here now, Chris.
Because I'll happily answer that. I think the football we played under Mauricio Pochettino was absolutely fantastic. We all really enjoyed the football. And I do understand a lot of the fans saying, bring Pochettino back. But, when you bring Jose Mourinho in, you expect to get over that line. You expect to win a trophy. And I feel exactly the same with Antonio Conte. And I just feel that when you go through Pochettino, Mourinho, Conte, if this doesn't work out for Conte, where on earth do you go? Do you go back to Pochettino? It's just...
Look, I'll talk about the style of play in a second. First of all, let's be truthful. The desires of the club supporters and the way the clubs are set up, it was amazing to me that Chelsea appointed Graham Potter and Spurs appointed Antonio Conte. Chelsea is a win now club, appointed a project manager. Spurs is a project and have appointed a win now manager. We'll see which of those breaks and buckles, because neither of those cannot hold. There's far too much dissonance, philosophical dissonance, to use a phrase that I regret using even as it's coming out of my mouth. There's far too much grinding of the gears in both those appointments for it to work out. Antonio Conte has a way of playing. And at the end of last season, when we were whacking 4 and 5 past teams, nobody was complaining about it. So it can work. It is true to say, though, that until 3 days ago, when Sean Dyche got back into work, nobody in the Premier League plays an essentially defensive game anymore. The game has changed too much. The VAR means that if you defend on the edge of your own box, you're always going to give away something. They'll find some reason to give away a penalty or something like that. I want the teams that I support, and I'm coming around to a conclusion here about this, to play on the front foot, to be aggressive, to attack, to risk losing 3-2, to increase the odds of winning 3-2. That, I would say, is the Spurs way, but, that's irrelevant. That's what I want to see. And I'll tell you for why. If you're watching your football in England and paying £80 a pop for the privilege, and you cannot guarantee trophies, which I believe you cannot guarantee because of everything I spoke about earlier, then the very least you'd expect is your team plays exciting football. And the times in this season, I say the end of last season, Spurs were playing very well, where Spurs' famous back three and wing backs has actually become a back five with two defensive midfielders pressed into that as well, and have struggled to get out of their own half, despite having what I think some very decent footballers there, is dispiriting. Now, Antonio Conte may not be to blame. I don't know. I'm not there. I'm not there in the dressing room. I'm not there on the training ground. What is causing them to be so lackluster, particularly in the first half of games? But I know it's been a struggle to watch them this year. A real struggle.
Who do you think will be Spurs manager at the start of next season? Do you think it'll be Conte?
Impossible to say. It's just impossible, Chris. Having let it get this far, who knows? We've now got another 6 months of speculation. And people say, but Spurs have got an option they can fire. Why would you fire up an option for someone who doesn't want to be there? That's the last thing you want. My suspicion is that Levy is tied to him to a large extent and will spend the next 3 or 4 months trying to persuade him to stay, while hopefully in the background, in a parallel process, will be scouring the earth for who is the next Maurizio Pochettino, who understands the modern game, has a wide knowledge of players, and wants to come in and coach what is a pretty decent group of players, if not maybe, a squad like Manchester City's. He needs to do both those things in parallel, because we can't have a repeat of what happened after Mourinho, where you just have an absolute vacuum at the club.
Danny,
the answer to your question is I don't know who'll be there at the start of next season.
Yeah, I just hope we don't wait another 72 days for a manager.
If they did, then the supporters on the terraces and the supporters' trust and all the rest of it would be absolutely within their rights to say that's a dereliction of duty, because it was the first time round.
Yeah, it just needs to be a real plan in place. What do you think of the transfer window? Of course, it just closed. Spurs have brought in 2 players, Danjuma and Porro. What do you think of it? Did we do enough?
No. Partially, I think, because I presume that Daniel Levy is, except for Chelsea, nobody spends big in January anyway. But partially, I think he's probably reluctant to bring in players, not if he doesn't know that the manager's going to be there, because the next manager comes along, these are not suitable for him. The problem is the right wing backs have been a problem. Though both of them do their level best. I have no problem with Matt Doherty or Emerson Royal in terms of having a go. In fact, I think if you could have combined the two of them, they might have made a very, very good player in that position. So they brought him in, and that's good. And I think if you look at it, if they're all playing well and not mucking around, the right side of Spurs' team with Romero, Porro, Kulusevski can do business. That to me looks like a proper European Premier League standard right side of midfield. Talk about the other side perhaps a little later. But what they haven't done is reinforce the team in the 2 areas I think most fans would think that there was most need. They haven't got a dominant centre half. They've got a good centre back in Romero, and I'm a big admirer of Eric Dyer, though I know his form has fallen off a cliff ever since he got back in the England squad. But they do need a dominant centre half. Everyone knows that. And the lack of creativity in midfield is very difficult to talk about, because, of course, we only play 2 in midfield, and they have to hold if the wing-backs are going to go forward. I pointed out on the View from the Lane podcast the other day that Spurs' midfield in a recent game was Matt Doherty, Højbjerg, Bentancur was injured, so it was probably Bissouma, and Ryan Sessegnon. That midfield is not going to create for you. It's not going to get you the ball enough forward. Kane is a genius, does what he does. Kulusevski is a very good player, but he doesn't play, in the centre of midfield. So they decided against bringing in a creative midfielder in the style of Christian Eriksen. And the reason, I guess, is those are very expensive commodities. If you go for Maddison, you better have 50 million quid in your bin. And again, why would you spend that unless you're absolutely obvious that you need a right wing back? Why would you spend that if you don't think Conte's going to be there? So The answer is they probably improved the squad. If you take Matt out, Pedro Porro in, Heel back to Spain, and Danjuma replacing him, that is, you've improved the first team by one player and the squad by two. Most teams won't have done more than that in the January window, but you think Spurs could have done one or two more to plump up the squad a bit. No, and because it's hard in January to improve the team, though they did it last January.
How confident are you?
Go on.
I was going to say, Danny, how confident are you that Spurs could finish in the top four with this current squad and the business that we have just done in January? Because I believe that we haven't done enough. I can't believe that we haven't signed a centre-back. But then saying that, I can't believe a month or so ago, Antonio Conte sat in a press conference and said, we don't need any centre-backs.
Yeah, I don't get these press conferences, and I'm not going to keep on about him. So I say, the man's in hospital. Let's give it a rest. I think it's difficult for Spurs to finish in the top four, but it's difficult every year. Manchester City are always going to finish in the top four. Liverpool, you would have said the same thing about by having a difficult season, and Chelsea too are having a difficult season. They have to integrate half the good young players in the world, but the Premier League doesn't allow you to stand still, and you could argue Spurs have stood still from the end of last season. You could argue that. And the problem is that Newcastle have come into it, and they're not going anywhere now. Newcastle haven't splurged money the way Chelsea did, but they are improving their squad day by day. And any player that Spurs might have their eye on, the boy from Everton is a good example. Newcastle have their eye on him as well. They can't offer them Champions League football yet. There are seven. The reason why the Premier League is so brilliant and so frightening and so frustrating is there are at least 7 teams who are financially and infrastructure and every other way equipped to challenge for the 4 places that are available for the Champions League. Spurs are one of those. And every year it's going to be until Guardiola leaves Manchester City, and then we'll see if they can find an equally good manager. Until then, it's always going to be an absolute scrap. Now, on the View from the Lane last year, Charlie Eccleshare told me all through the second half of the season, and he watches Spurs every week. He writes about them every week. He told me that they were going to finish in the top 4, and I did not believe him. I've tried to learn a lesson to be more optimistic then. And of course, if they hit a run of form in the second half of the season, like they had in the second half of last season, they will probably make it. It's going to be nip and indeed tuck, my friend.
Danny, what do you make of all the players out on loan at the moment? Because I'm going to name 2 of them, Lo Celso and Ndombele, £100 million between the 2 of them.
Well, there's 2 things going on there. One, it's unfortunate that they recruited players, certainly in the case of Ndombele, there was a great deal of excitement when he came. He had dominated Manchester City in a Champions League game for Lyon, 2 Champions League games for Lyon and all the rest of it. And it just hasn't worked out for whatever reasons. Lo Celso would have been in a team that won the World Cup if he hadn't been injured, but it hasn't worked out. It's a real problem for Spurs. They are reluctant to spend big money on players because they've had other issues, and I'll say the ground is one of them, though the debt for that, as I understand it, is now out on the horizon, 30 years away, a lot of it. And the other thing is that it's run as a business. They're not there to promote a nation state. They're not there to further enhance a portfolio worth billions in the United States, where you've got a franchise of a portfolio of other sports clubs. They're there to hopefully make it go well, and then they're going to sell it. Though quite how you go about selling something as expensive as Spurs these days is a mystery to me. I've now forgotten what the tune of your question was.
About Ndombele and Lo Celso, £100 million. Because we do spend money, Danny. I know a lot of fans say we don't spend money, we don't spend enough money, but we have spent money, but it just hasn't worked out on a lot of these players. Yeah,
and at the moment, we're now into February, and Richarlison hasn't scored a goal, and spent £60 million on him. Now, Premier League goal, that's right. Got very important goals in Europe. That brace he got. The problem is the transfer market is completely weird at the very top of it. In the old days, you'd have bought those players, and they would have failed. You'd sold them on at a loss of 5 or 10, of 10 or 20%. Unfortunately, Premier League clubs, the big Premier League clubs, don't do business with each other anymore. They are in competition, so they don't spend their vast riches on each other's players by and large. Harry Kane might one day turn out to be an exception to that rule, but it didn't happen the other day when everyone thought he'd go to City. And the second thing is, of course, you can't get the money from Europe because the European leagues are skint. By comparison with the Premier League, they are skint. They cannot. So every deal's a loan now. These players who are surplus to requirement of big Premier League clubs, and Spurs is a good example, will see out their contracts on loan at clubs on the continent. They won't go to other Premier League clubs because we don't do business with each other very much. And the European clubs certainly can't afford the transfer fees. In fact, most of the big clubs in Europe, certainly in Portugal, certainly in Holland, increasingly in Germany, and I think the Italian clubs are coming that way as well. They depend on for their ongoing sustainability and their ongoing existence, not on local television deals, which are paltry by compared with the Premier Leagues, but by selling their players to the Premier League and getting in players from the Premier League on loan to bulk out their squads. Look at Juventus, look at Inter Milan, look at Lukaku, £100 million footballer out on loan a year later. This is not sustainable. It can't keep going like this. But that's the reason why Spurs are among those who've got so many apparently good players. No one could afford them once they've been in the top 6 in the Premier League.
Danny, I don't know whether you'll like this question or not. Who do you think isn't good enough to play for Spurs that's in the squad at the moment?
Well, they're all playing for Spurs, so the question is kind of weird. Do you mean in a perfect world?
Well, to go up to that next level, because the way I see it, you bring Antonio Conte in. He wants to come in. He wants to take us to that next level. He wants to build something, and he wants to put a trophy in the cabinet. Because someone like Antonio Conte, he just doesn't turn up to a football club wanting to finish in a Champions League spot. He wants to win.
Yeah, but everybody wants to win, Chris. Everyone wants to win, but it's not possible for everyone to win. You've got, as I say, 11 of the richest 20 clubs in the world. Only one of them can win the league. I mean, I don't get this thing of I'm here to win. You're here to do your best and hopefully win. It's modern bollocks talk to say I'm going to win. I'm going to build a winning. It's not possible. There's at least 3, 4, 5, 6 managers in the Premier League who are proven winners. They're not all going to win. 20% of them are going to win. With Newcastle coming in, 16% of them are going to win. 84% of them are not going to win. As regards to players, look, we got to be very careful here as fans. When they bought Reguilon, there was great excitement. Young Spanish international. When they bought Emerson Royal, well, he's come from Barcelona. He's bound to be good. They haven't worked out for Spurs. We don't, at the present moment, move in the marketplace of certainty. So what we have to have is smarts whereby you get in a Bentancur or a Kulusevski who are not doing it at their current club, although Bentancur played a lot of times for Juventus. Let's not kid ourselves. And train them and adapt them to the Premier League and hope they're going to get better. But, and I'm going to have to, the words are going to turn to ash in my mouth, as Arsenal have shown, and this is, I guess, what you're asking me about, in the end, if you really want to do it, you have to do 2 things. Get rid of the ones who are not necessarily bad players, but not the right fit. Your Lacazettes, your Aubameyangs, your Ozils, your Kolasinac's, all players brought into Arsenal at massive expense and let go for nothing, by the way. And you have to spend £50 million on Ben White as a gamble that he's going to turn out to be a great centre-half. Turns out he's a good right-back. You have to spend the money on buying Manchester City's cast-offs because they know how to win the Premier League. And at the moment, Spurs haven't done that. I like many of the players in the current squad, but let's be truthful. Langlay's a stopgap, isn't he? A combination of Bentancur and Højbjerg is in many ways too repetitive. You need perhaps a little bit more creativity in there. But everything's so unpredictable. Last year, Son wins the Golden Boot. This year, I don't know if you've got any football boots, Chris, but I think you would probably have done better over the sort of 25 matches that he's played. I wouldn't. You know, my knee's gone, but you might. I mean, Son has become, as Lucas Moura has become unavailable through injury, Son has become Lucas Moura, high energy, running into brick walls, and with occasional great goal. I mean, I pray, because I love the man to the spots of my DNA. I love him. I prayed it all comes back for him. But do you know what?
Do you think he struggled?
Don't know. Probably, I suspect the mask didn't help. But I also think that the arrival of Richarlison, whose best position is wide left, some people respond to that kind of threat, and I'm not sure that he has done. But we know there's a great footballer in there. But as the weeks tick by, you're starting to bite your lips slightly, aren't you? But, you know, surely this week, he got 2 great goals the other day, didn't he? Albeit against slightly, you know, with all due respect to Preston, slightly less taxing opposition. But he can still do it. That's obvious. And in some ways, it was the second one that was, you know, more of an example, because it took a burst of physical volcanicity to get him into the position to score the goal. Perisic is a brilliant footballer, but he's not a left back. He ought to be playing further forward. And again, he plays the position that Son plays in the national team. And it's telling that he hasn't scored a goal. Though he was very unlucky at the Etihad, wasn't he? And Eric Dyer cannot be. He's not in great form. But my answer to you is these are all players who, if Spurs were humming as they were at the end of last season, you know, playing really well, nobody was saying these players are no good. Matt Doherty played game after game after game and was an agent of chaos down the right-hand side. Trouble is, you get judged on the last 4 games rather than the last year and a half, you know?
Hugo Lloris has had, an indifferent season so far. Is it time to change our goalkeeper?
I'm up for the Mug of the Month competition here, the award. At the start of the season, it was put to me that he was getting, would he be a problem? And I said, well, we're very lucky. For 10 years, and very few fans can say this, we haven't had to worry about the goalkeeper. Hugo's been amazing. He's been a fantastic servant. The game has changed around Hugo, hasn't it? 2 things have happened. He's 6 foot, whatever he is. Goalkeepers are now 6'6", 6'7". They're huge. And, you know, and it's cliche to say it, most of them are pretty good footballers now, can pass the ball out from the back. And that, I think, has undermined Hugo's confidence that the game that's been demanded of him now is not the game he learned when he was at school. This thing of making mistakes, though, it really is inexplicable, unless it just is a function of age, a function of tiredness. He's captained 2 teams to a World Cup final. It's a lot of responsibility. But let's be fair, he was dropping clangers before he went to Qatar. It's a mystery to me, but what is clear is that you can't have a goalkeeper who is not in good form for very, very long. I'm all for him playing out the rest of this season. Spurs should be planning a succession for him as we speak, and I'm sure they are.
What does Spurs need to do in the summer, Danny, to improve the squad? Because I think a lot of Spurs fans felt that a centre-back needed to come in this window, in the January window. But surely a lot more additions need to come in the summer, including a goalkeeper.
It depends on who's managing the team. If Conte was to sign a 3-year contract, then they need 2 centre-backs. Because, you need 6 at the club. And much as I keep waiting for Davinson Sanchez to be the player he promised to be when we bought him, there's another one, by the way, probably need 2 centre-backs. I think you need a left-sided defender who's an upgrade on what we've got. And I've got no problem, by the way, with Ben Davis, who I think has been a stalwart for the club. And if Ben was the worst player at the club, we'd be in very good shape indeed, you know. But if we're going to play this system, you need to upgrade that defence. If Kane stays, the attack looks like it's got plenty of things going on for it. I just wish that Antonio Conte was less stubborn, because in another world, a fantasy world, this team would have been transformed. Jed Spence would have been a success. And notice there were huge clubs in for Jed Spence when it came time to get hold of him. Bissouma would have been at least a break for Højbjerg's legs, and Richarlison would have 12 Premier League goals. None of them have been given a proper chance for a variety of reasons, including in the case of Richarlison, unfortunately timed injuries. But the manager is very, very stubborn. So it is a question of, if he's there, they've got to improve that defence. If he's not, then I think there are a lot of talented players at Spurs or out at loan at other clubs who might well blossom under a different kind of manager.
Danny, can I ask your opinion about club signings? Should the manager be signing the players like the old days?
No, absolutely not. The club has to decide what kind of club it is, because otherwise you get into this endless cycle of signing players for the manager signs the players, then he goes. The average length of, if you took Klopp and Guardiola out of the stats, it's down to less than 2 years now, the average tenure of a Premier League manager. We are in exactly the place we used to laugh about the Continentals now. We hire and fire managers, coaches, as they're called now, willy-nilly. And I don't think and it have any problem with that. It hasn't done Real Madrid any problem changing the manager all the time. It hasn't done the Italian clubs much of a problem. It hasn't left them much of a problem. So, sorry, again, it all revolves around Conte, doesn't it? Remind me again what the start of that question was. Forgive me. I've got so many things written down on a piece of paper in front of me I need to say. Go on.
Danny, let's move on. Do you get to go to many Spurs games now? When was the last game you went to?
Oh God, it was last season actually, because I've with the COVID, the grounds were closed. I moved to live in Ireland, so no, I don't get to go very, very often. I'm coming over in the next few weeks, and hopefully I'll get to catch a game then. The travelling, I used to go back and forth to London to work, has been cut down by discovering these technologies, which allowed you to broadcast from hundreds of miles away to the world. And we hope I'm not going to get in trouble. Dublin Airport is a hellhole. I'm looking forward to getting over there, though, probably in March. And hopefully somebody at The Athletic will have a ticket tucked away for me to go and see Spurs in person. No, so I don't see them very, very often. Although, given what I do for a living, I don't think that's the biggest problem. I get very involved in the games when I'm at the stadium. My volatility is noted. Whereas if you watch them on TV, at least you can watch the match, go mad, then watch it again, a bit more safely. But I love going to the ground. I had Pete Abbott, the stadium announcer, who's an old chum of mine, on the podcast the other day, and we were just the sound of his voice as the players are running out, and then the players come out onto the pitch, those white shirts again. It's a difficult thing to miss, but I made the decision to. There's Joe and Mohammed. Hello, Joe. It's a difficult decision to move to this part of the world, but part of the price I paid is I don't get to see them in the flesh as often as I used.
Danny, how did you feel when you entered White Hart Lane for the very first time, and then, of course, the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium for the first time?
It's hard to remember the first time going into the old stadium. I certainly remember the last time. I was there working for the last day, the game against Manchester United, for Talk Sport. The radio broadcast points you've probably been in them. They were a chiseled out slit, about the size of one average sized human being, who you slid in, and then you had those windows behind the press box through which I can remember doing a commentary with Stan Collymore. Stan would not accept that you can't see the corners from the old commentary box at Spurs, so he would hang out the window, like somebody looking for somebody off a train down the platform to try and see the corners and all the rest of it. My big old heart broke that day, as the old players ran out to the pitch, as Spurs completed that unbeaten season at the Lane. And, a lot of my emotional blood, sweat and tears, cash, were in that ground. I'm not a Luddite. I know things have to change. I'm so grateful that it's geographically in exactly the same spot, if only for the continued existence of the Chick King. And of course, you go to the new stadium. And it's a wonderment. It's one of the great wonders of the world. Along with the Texas Stadium, it's the best stadium in the world. It's certainly the best football stadium in the world. We should be very proud of it, but not if it's at the cost of having a decent team on the pitch. But when I went there, you felt. I mean, how can I don't own Spurs. I own my memories of Spurs. That's all I own, and yet I felt a surge of pride at the stadium. It's counterintuitive. It's a ridiculous thing to think. I'm very proud of the new Spurs stadium. The first time I went there, I think I was awed because I went to the opening game at the new Wembley. England played Brazil to open the new stadium. Ledley King played in midfield for England. He did. And I remember thinking, yep, big old stadium, been there, done that. The first time I went to Arsenal's new stadium, it was the best stadium in the country then, but it was an example of the high point of the last wave of stadium design. Spurs is a new thing altogether. And it's amazing and beautiful. And I cried when I went, yeah. Of course I cried.
Danny, of course, our next game is on Sunday against Manchester City. Of course, a couple of weeks ago, they beat us 4-2 after us being 2-0 up at the Etihad Stadium. How do you see this game going?
Spurs got a very good record against Manchester City. They've shown they can score against Manchester City. Manchester City haven't got many goals away from home in recent times, where the contradiction of the fact that Haaland is going to get 50 goals but hasn't improved them as a team, these are the facts. Look, my wife's an Arsenal fan. She won't want to hear me saying this. They're the best team in Europe. Look at the squad depth in every position. Chelsea has got potential squad depth. They've got actual. When you can let Cancelo, who was last year along with Reece James the best fullback in the entire league, when you can blithely let him go to a Champions League rival, trust me, you've got a great team. I think, as always, I'm not a great believer that the crowd can win football matches, but the noise that can be generated inside that specially designed shell is so fantastic. I think the crowd have got a big part to play, and I'm optimistic that Spurs won't get beat. I'll put it no more strongly than that. What's your
score prediction?
2-2.
2-2. So what's it like being married to an Arsenal fan?
I'm really used to it, aren't I? I was brought up in Highbury, big Irish family. Every single one of them supports Arsenal, and I mean supports Arsenal. Everybody I've ever known and loved has supported Arsenal. The lady wife was a season ticket holder until we moved over here. So I've had to put up with it. I'm made of iron about it. I don't worry about them the way other Spurs fans do. What can I do about what Arsenal do? That means nothing to me. I want to beat them in the derbies, but beyond that, and I get into terrible trouble in the podcast when they win the title. What can I do about that? If they get more points than Manchester City, they are deserving champions of England. Furthermore, they are, if they do it, I know we'll all be heartbroken, but if they do it, it gives Daniel Levy no more excuses. He won't be able to say, but an oil station state team is one that has to win the title. Yeah, I said, well, they've done it without that. And so he'll have less excuse as well. I mean, obviously, we hope to beat Manchester City and then they go on a brilliant run after Sunday. That's probably the best thing for everybody concerned.
Danny, very last question for you. Can you give us some your favourite memories and favourite players over the years supporting Tottenham?
Oh, God. I mean, it's impossible, isn't it? We've been lucky. Whatever about trophies and all the rest of that stuff, I have watched a succession of wonderful footballers over there. I know it's where all football fans, you have to call it over there, don't you? I mean, the stadium. I guess, and some pretty good teams as well. The Pochettino team was the best team. And those of us who watched the team in the early 80s, the won the UEFA Cup and all the rest of it, that's a big thing to say. That team, I guess, sits very, very easily with me, the two FA Cups and the UEFA Cup, because Glenn Hoddle is a genius, but he wasn't even the best player in that Spurs midfield. Ardiles was an incredible footballer of the type that, given the way that he got the ball, kept the ball, and the vision that he had once he decided to pass it, if you can imagine N'Golo Kante with vision, that's what Ardiles was. So he played the ball short and ran with it. Hoddle played the ball long and admired his brilliant passes. So that team has they're two great players. We had the seasons with Klinsmann. What a footballer he was. Pat Jennings is the greatest goalkeeper I've ever seen. I could go on and on and on. And I hope that somewhere, Kane is a genius. Somewhere in the muddle we've got ourselves into now with the manager and the coming and the going and all the rest of it, and the problems surrounding Paratici, let's be absolutely clear about this. That he's not been found guilty of anything in this country. He's not been found guilty of anything in the court of law, but it's not a good situation. Somewhere in all this mess, Newcastle have shown it, Manchester United have shown it, and Arsenal have shown it. It doesn't take long to turn it around. People have managed to want 5-year plans. I hope that sometime in the next 18 months, I will see players and a team that will eclipse all those I've just told you about. But the answer to your question, I said I could do another hour with you on the great players and teams I've seen there. I've been blessed to follow Tottenham. Blessed.
Danny, if Conte does leave,
I thought that was the last question.
I've got to ask this. If he was to leave, who would you like? If you could choose the next Spurs manager, who would you like?
I think he'll be available. Someone like Christophe Galtier at PSG, somebody who's shown he can deal with players, plays really, really attacking football. But that's not for me to say. I'm not a scout. I don't sit there all day. I don't think because I can play Championship manager and football manager that I know everything about that level of football. That's for somebody above my pay grade. But trust me, out there are lots and lots of brilliant and talented coaches. The fear is you keep going back to the super elite of coaches. That's not how Pochettino arrived at the club. That's not how Bill Nicholson arrived at the club. That's not how Keith Birkinshaw arrived at the club. There's something more than just picking Chelsea's ex-managers. Although I suppose Graham Potter will be on the market as well. I don't know is the answer.
Oh, no. Well, Danny, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. And
it's been a joy doing it.
I only upset you on one question and said modern day bollocks on the on one of them. So I've done well.
Yeah, I know I was trying to be on my best behaviour because it's you, Chris.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you on. Please tell everyone where they can find you on social media, and please tell everyone about the podcast as well.
Sure. Thank you very much for that. I'm on Twitter as at Danny Kelly Words, at Danny Kelly Words, and you can hear me on TalkSport. And if you're interested, because it's free from all of your podcast providers, I do The View from the Lane, which is, as I say, there are many good Spurs podcasts out there. I'm very proud of what we do. And if you want to hear the game discussed, a furious level, but without just being furious, I think it's a place for you.
Well, Danny, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure having you on. I'd love to get you on again because you can talk for England, and there is so much more for me to ask you.
So much of it is rubbish, though, Chris. You have to mine through it for the good bits. But yes, I come on again next time soon. Yeah, very good.
Thank you so much, and you've had such wonderful feedback by the from the viewers today. So
thank you to all the viewers. Fancy, look at me and Chris. It's hardly Hollywood, is it? So thank you all for coming on as well and watching us.
Well, thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks for listening. Until the next time, come on, you Spurs.